Hello! So today's video I am sitting in a chair that's new, and it's in part because I actually have nothing planned for today's video. I basically started my year really busy, and therefore I can't get back to making my routine content. That being said, I have a improvisation in spirit of one of the books I'm going to talk about. So I just figured, well, you guys like books, I like books, there's never a bad day where you go to a bookstore or have a conversation about books. So I picked some of the more interesting books off my shelf to share with you guys. Now, I want to say there's a bit of a problem here. I have 1,400 books. That is not the problem, that is a blessing. The problem is I pick the same damn books that I think are really interesting out of the 1,400 books that I own. So I tried to go a little bit different than what I would usually pick, and disclaimer, I have not read a single one of these books that I'm about to show you. There are hundreds of books on my shelf that I have not read, because I'm a collector as well as a reader. So the stack is over here, and we will start with this one. So the first one is The Origins and History of Consciousness. Now, there might be some Jungian fans out there who like Jungian psychology. This is a book that Jung has been quoted to say, but I have not seen the quote myself, at least I don't remember, that this is the book he wished he wrote. That's a tongue twister, I guess. Eric Newman. This book is an explanation of conscious experiences as they relate to development. So basically, this person went through different cultures, different myths around the world, and found that these myths have a common pattern, and that pattern can be used to explain human development in general. So basically what Jung was doing is looking at archetypes and how they relate to individuals and development, etc., etc., etc. That's basically what this book is going to be, and for that reason it's probably one of the more interesting books that I have on my bookshelf. So now let's look at another one. The Oxford Handbook of Bioethics. I meant to read this a very, 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 very long time ago, and I have not yet read it. So this book will go over some of the cool debates in bioethics. I mean, most Oxford handbooks are pretty systematic. I'm a big fan of them. I kind of destroy them as well. And this one's going to talk about things like, for example, population genetics. Most of the people that I've spoken to about like the concept of race have accepted that it's like kind of a defunct concept when you talk about it in terms of phenotypical presentation, or like how people physically look. And they've since moved to things like population genetics to define this concept in the scientific sense. And it talks about the ethics around things like population genetics. It also talks about whether you can declare someone dead or not. The technical definition of deceased is something that can be debated. Biodata banks, like basically the rules and policies we need to develop for storing biodata inside of a basically biodata bank, what goes on around that. It's kind of systematic in that sense. Again, Oxford handbooks do that, and that's why I have this book, and I think it's one of the more interesting books on my shelf, maybe in part because the artwork is also interesting. And another. Okay. The Prophet. The Life of Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. This, honest to God, I'm not like a Trotsky fan or anything, but I think this much detail about one person's life is definitely going to be interesting, and that's the only reason I got this book. I was literally in the bookstore looking at this going, which kind of human being would read this? And I thought I was that human being that would read this. I think it's a biography of Trotsky, and it's just really fat. So that's the only reason why it is on this shelf, and it's the only reason why I think it's interesting. I feel like most people would not even pick up a book like this. And yeah, I mean, Trotsky's also an important figure. Not that I agree with him or anything, but he's still important. So it's on there. Next book, The Great Mother, by Eric Newman, same guy. Also an interesting book. I feel like any book I've never really, there's one book that I found about mythology that was really bad. It was the Roman mythology book. in general, books that cover mythology are really nice and delicious. I feel like because the myths really map well onto life. Like the whole Greek myth about the god of the vine was really, really fun. So in general, books about mythology are going to be interesting. But this one in specific deals with the feminine archetype and its roles throughout human history in terms of culture. So again, very Jungian in that sense. And it's going to be like the other book, but instead this time with the specific focus on the representations of mothers in myths, or like the feminine. I saw a tweet recently with Jordan Peterson referencing this book. I feel like the tweet probably is not a good representation of this book, but that being said, it is an interesting book nonetheless, and if you like mythology, then you'll like this. To no surprise, we have another non-fiction book. Look, I have fiction books. You guys don't know this, but I have a lot of fiction books, like hundreds. I do read fiction. In fact, I recently got a fiction book. I'll show it to you. I recently got this fiction book that I'm super excited to read. It's about like mistreated middle-class laboring woman in Japan, and they basically like kill somebody because of the pressures placed onto them by society, and they all conspire to like get away with the crime. I do read fiction, just not as much as I read nonfiction. I'm obsessed with nonfiction. I feel like when I read fiction, it's more like an experience. You know, I sit down, have a tea, maybe I sit in front of the window, in front of a sunset, read a book. You know, kind of like this. Nonfiction, it's like I have something I want to conquer or achieve, get some ideas going to help me achieve that, or if I want to learn about a particular country, stuff like that. So this book, anyways, Marx and Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, I'm not even super left-leaning. I think I'm a centrist. But I do like to read different ideas across the spectrum, okay? And this book in specific I thought was very, very interesting because I didn't realize how much disagreement there was amongst Marxists, again, in part because I'm not a Marxist. Marxists do not get along with each other all that well, and you can actually categorize Marxists by geography. This is probably like one of the more interesting books I've actually read on Marxism besides Marx's actual works, right? And yeah, I feel like Marxism is mentioned a lot, but the disagreements amongst Marxists is not discussed a lot, which I think is important. And for that reason, this book is on here. It's one of the more interesting books that I own. Let's grab another. In line with the politics, I guess, this is by chance, The Anatomy of Fascism. So this book is actually super cool. Basically, I had this debate with someone about fascism and like what it really is and whether like it was a unique, discernible, like identifiable political ideology, because there are a lot of overlaps, and this book does make that argument. He says, like, I'm going to paraphrase what I remember here, because I read the Wikipedia about this book before I got it, that it's a combination of autocracy, dictatorship, so like centralized planned economy, and nationalism. I believe that was it, and he says that basically at least Italy and Germany are true examples of this, where you have this cult of personality around Hitler and Mussolini. Both of them were spending like 60 to 80% of their GDP on military spending. The government had a bunch of policies set forward for private businesses and how they could invest, so on and so forth. So they controlled the economy. They were both super nationalistic. Yeah, that's what this book is going to basically characterize as a discernible, identifiable set of beliefs that form a unique political ideology called fascism. And a lot of people confuse fascism with things like just simply autocracy or dictatorship, right? And on top of that, most interestingly, I realized if you go by that definition of fascism, America, if it had no disagreement amongst the central powers, could very readily become fascist, in my opinion. Like if the judiciary, executive, and legislative all got along and cooperated to force businesses to do things and so on and so forth, and then they came around a cult of personality in the executive, theoretically America could become a fascist state. Not that I think it's going to happen, it seems super unreasonable. Republicans and Democrats hate each other, so we don't have to worry about anything there. Okay, this one I got a long time ago when I was studying economics in university, and most people who I've mentioned this book to and who also studied economics never read this book, which surprised me. So I believe this guy was either the inventor or the popularizer of the term natural value in economics. And this entire book is dedicated to determining the natural value of a commodity or a good, or just an asset in general, looking at the natural value of things. And I mean, sure, it's readily applicable to economics, but you could also use the ideas and methods in here to determine the natural value of more intangible goods or intangible things like beliefs and so on and so forth. And he actually does provide like, it's not just the word natural value, he provides concrete models for what is natural value. And I think that's a super interesting thing. Yeah, for that reason, that's why this book is on here. It's like a primary source in economics for the concept of natural value. Okay, the master and his emissary. The divided brain and the making of the Western world. So, I know very little about this book. I'm going to be honest with you. I saw this book on Amazon 101 times. And I know there's a cancer biography that has a similar title. I don't actually remember where I got this book. I don't. Not that I have anything against the book. I don't remember where I got it. Because I already had my neuroscience trip, my fill of neuroscience readings. Not that I will never read neuroscience again, it's just not where I am right now. And this book in particular, I believe, goes over different elements of Western culture and society and how they are basically, they've come into existence as a result of different neural processes in the brain. I believe the left and right hemisphere trope is heavily played in this book as well. But yeah, that's actually quite an interesting take. I've never seen anyone do this. I've seen some people do this where they take neuroscience and use it in ways that are not going to be supported by the research whatsoever, in the sense of like the idea that, oh, like, I don't know, these mathematicians were using right hemisphere processing to create this concept and develop this field of mathematics. But that's way beyond anything that could be substantiated by modern research techniques, and that's what this book is going to do, I believe. I haven't read it yet, but we'll see. I'm sure it's going to be a great book. Another book that you might have seen if you watch my library tour videos is Fully Grown, Why a Stagnant Economy is a Sign of Success. So what I like about this book is that there is virtually no other book that I've come across that is like this. The idea is stagnation is not a problem to be solved, it is a sign of success. In economics, there is actually a large debate about what causes stagnation and what cures stagnation. Stagnation, I don't even remember the technical meaning behind it's called stagnation. It's like basically when there's like no GDP growth and then you have a little bit of inflation. I believe that's it. Basically, you're stagnant. But yeah, this book argues that that's going to be a good thing and that it's a representation of a mature economy that doesn't need to actually grow anymore. I don't know how it's going to make that concept palatable, because that to me also sounds like you're happy with the current levels of relative wealth inequality, and also you're happy with the current levels of absolute poverty. And I can't think of a single society or country or nation where I would be willing to say that I'm okay with the current levels of absolute poverty. But maybe this person has different arguments about that. I subscribe a little bit to the infinite growth model, not because I think there's infinite growth, but because I think we actually are making genuine growth year over year. I do think that some GDP growth is obviously like debt-based or not real, but other forms of GDP growth, like maybe 1% of it, 2% of it, are real every year, and so I don't think that we are in an infinite growth model that isn't based off of real growth. At any rate, yeah, this is an interesting book. I'm excited to read it. We'll see what the conclusion is, because I have a lot of questions. I do, and I'm assuming most people would have a lot of questions, so hopefully they answer them. Now, another book on my list that I haven't read, but I've discussed it a lot, So I'll try and be as genuine as possible in saying that be skeptical of what I'm about to say because I don't think I understand all of the book. The idea behind this book, it's Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, is to take fitness maximization and apply it to religion and evolution. Fitness maximization is the idea that any behaviors that maximize the number of offspring or the likelihood of having offspring, that maximizes those, either one of those numbers, is an adaptive behavior. Now that is sociobiology. Evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology would look at physiological structures and call them adaptations, right? As opposed to adaptation. Wait, no, that's the same word. Adaptive. Something can be adaptive versus an adaptation. Okay, that's it. Yeah, in sociobiology, we say things are adaptive. In physiology, we say something is an adaptation, usually referring to a specific physiological structure. So, like your arm or your thumb is an adaptation, whereas the things you do with your thumb can be adaptive in sociobiology. I hope that is clear. So this person is David Sloan Wilson, not Edward Sloan Wilson, sorry, or not Edward O. Wilson. It's David Sloan Wilson. He says that religion is a fitness maximizer and is an adaptive thing, and he'll say things like, for example, if being part of a religious group makes you have more offspring, it's because religion is adaptive. The reason why religion is still present in the context of rationality and science is because it is an adaptive function, as opposed to like in evolutionary psychologists who might say that we have neural networks designed for social behaviors, and those neural networks are adaptations that are productive, but again, he's saying the actual behavior of religion itself is an evolutionary trait. Now, some naturalists will disagree with this because it's a very contentious thing to say that groups evolve as an organism, which is the claim he's making. The claim is that he's saying that society and groups are organisms that evolve and have their own traits as well. He's kind of bringing the level of evolution up from physiology towards groups. He could say that maybe he's an emergentist about evolution. That's what he's doing. Not usually what a naturalist would argue. Again, I haven't read the book yet, so I can't steel man the position. That's the best I can do, so be skeptical with what I'm saying. But it's an interesting book, one of the most interesting books on my shelf, for sure. The next one is an old library book that I bought in America, bought it used. It's called On Creating a Role by Stanislavski or something like this. I got his name. Yeah, Creating a Role. And the name is Konstantin Stanislavski. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a book about method acting. He has a few books, but this is one of his more popular books. It's about, so like if you don't know, there are different types of acting, and one camp of acting will say, for example, that you need to adopt the emotions of a character. Another camp of acting will say that you just need to mimic the character really, really genuinely. And then another set of acting will say that you need to actually live the character's experiences, live their life, become that character, let go of who you are, and embody the next character kind of thing. The emotion one and the embodying the character one are both types of method acting. And then the other kinds of acting would fall into like the mimicry, or just copy basically to the best of your ability what you think that person would do. This book is a method acting book that talks about using method acting to create a role, different exercises you can do, different ways of studying the characters, so that you can then set up a routine or set up a way of life that you basically live the character you're supposed to be for a set period of time. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 4 months. Daniel Day-Lewis is a method actor. He's probably one of my favorite method actors. He's very famous for having almost died from the pneumonia when he did The Gangs of New York, because he didn't want to receive modern medicine that his character wouldn't have access to. At any rate, this is a super cool book, and if you've never studied anything about acting, I'd highly recommend it. And this is one of probably the more famous texts. Definitely an interesting book. The last book on this list is I Am a Strange Loop by Douglas Hofstadter. I want to clarify one thing before I say anything about this book. If you're super familiar with philosophy of mind or like modern cognitive neuroscience, this book might be a little bit of a rehash or things you're already familiar with. But if you're not, then this book will be really interesting. I can imagine like 17-year-old me would have read this and would have been mind blown. Okay, the idea is that like there are levels of the brain, like physical and symbolic, and the question is, do symbolic representations such as I feed back into the physical? Now there are a lot of presuppositions made in this book, obviously, but if you entertain it, it's an interesting series of ideas where, for example, is I just like an illusion? When you say I, what is I? Like, what are you when you're talking about like your conscious point of view? Does the symbolic level of processing, such as like I and so on and so forth, have a feedback into the actual brain? And does the brain feedback, is there an actual loop going on here? This is kind of the premise of the book. It's probably one of the more unique books I've ever seen. I don't think I've ever seen a book that has dealt with that specific set of problems and asked a specific set of questions. And Hofstadter's a good writer, he's obviously a smart guy. And so it's for that reason, it's gonna be one of these interesting books on my shelf. I haven't read it yet, but I've talked about it with people, and yeah, the general insight I've been given was that if you're familiar with these topics already, avoid the book. But if you haven't gone down this path yet, then this is a super interesting book for you to read. So those are some of the interesting books on my shelf. I tried to pick more esoteric topics, nothing too mainstream, I guess. Like The Wealth of Nations would have been a terrible choice, right? Or like Das Kapital 1, 2, and 3. I hoped you like those books. If you have any books like this, I have other books like this as well, but if you have any other books like this that are like, wow, that's a really unique topic or like a unique book, I want to hear about it. I like these kinds of books. I have like a 700-page book on melancholy. You might have seen it before. I've talked about it. And it's just literally different points of view on the nature of melancholy. Like how intellectuals become engaged in melancholy, the impact on character that happens from melancholy, just a bunch of melancholy topics, and it's written in Old English as well, which is really cool. Yeah, anyways, any esoteric books that you have, please share with me. I will look into them. And with that being said, hadi bye bye.